Welcome to Cloud Automation using AWS Command Line tool. In this section, we want to understand what AWS is, what are some of the services that are supported by AWS. We look at how to install AWS CLI on our laptop, and we'll figure out how to configure AWS CLI. Before we can use the CLI, we need to configure it with our access credentials. And then we'll use AWS CLI to manipulate the EC2 service. We'll start an EC2 instance. We'll also look at how to use AWS CLI to manipulate S3 objects. We can create a bucket, we can copy files back and forth. So we'll look at that in detail. So what is AWS CLI? AWS CLI is known as a unified command line tool to manage our AWS resources. All this time we have used the AWS console to create our resources. The AWS CLI is an alternate way of accessing those resources. And the reason we call it unified is all the services are under the primary command AWS. So you would have something like AWS S3, AWS EC2, AWS RDS, and so on and so forth. So we could use the CLI to start and stop our resources and to manage our resources. Like I said, it's an alternate to AWS console. And almost all the AWS services are supported by the CLI. And there is the CLI can be installed on your Windows laptop and on a Linux laptop or on a Mac laptop. So AWS console is the most common way like we've seen all this time to start our services. But when you want to start hundreds of instances, it becomes very tedious because you have to click. You have to say, choose this option, choose that option. It becomes very cumbersome when you're talking about starting hundreds of instances or hundreds of services at the same time. The CLIs can help us automate these steps so that they can be wrapped in the shell scripts, or they can be run on a command line very quickly and efficiently. Another tool that we'll talk about next is the AWS SDK or Software Development Kit that also provides additional flexibility to manage these AWS services within a programming language of our choice. So in other words, we can configure these SDKs and CLIs to start creating the services based on dependency. For instance, if you want to create an EC2 instance, it needs to have an AMI defined, the security group defined, and the VPC defined. So all those things can be configured using SDKs and CLI. The other option sometimes we have to do is we have to wait for one service to completely come up before we can start another instance. For example, if you are creating a load balancer, we want to make sure the instances are up before they can be added to a load balancer. We can programmatically use these SDKs to create queues, also known as SQS, simple queue service, or we can use these SDKs to write our own event-driven programming using a service that was recently announced called AWS Lambda. So how do we use AWS CLI? AWS CLI requires the Python language installed on our operating system. Anything above 2.7 is recommended for CLI. For Windows operating systems, the MSI installer, Microsoft installer is an option. For Linux and Mac, there is a tool called pip, Python pip, that's used to install the CLI. They also have something called a bundle installer, which you can download a zip file, and all the CLI will be available for the operating system. So let's go ahead and install AWS CLI. Like I discussed earlier, AWS CLI requires the Python language to be installed on your laptop. In addition to Python, it also requires this tool called pip. And so the first thing we need to do is we need to use this curl command to download the pip program, and then use Python to run or to install that pip program. Once pip is installed, we could use that to install the AWS CLI itself. So the steps are download the pip program, install the pip program, and use the pip command to install our CLI. Before we could use the CLI, we need to authenticate ourselves to Amazon Web Services. And the way to authenticate is using the AWS access key and secret key. It's optional, but it's also recommended that we specify the default AWS region that we want to use in our commands. If you do not specify that, so every time we run a CLI, we have to specify the region that we are talking about. So it's best to specify this region when we are configuring the AWS CLI. So the way to configure the CLI is to run this command called AWS space configure. When you run this command, it's going to prompt us for the access key, it's going to prompt us for the secret key, and then it's going to prompt us for the region that we are interested in, and then the output format, we can specify a different output format, the text or the JSON XML format or the text format if you are interested. Most of us would have multiple AWS accounts, and the way to specify multiple AWS accounts is to use what's known as profiles. So in this case, we are creating a AWS configure profile for John Doe. So this could be the name of the account, or it could be the name of the other customer account that you're managing, and the process is the same way. So you specify the access key, the secret key, the default region that you're interested in, and the output format that you're interested in. So once you run that AWS configure command, the credentials are stored in a file called .aws is the directory it creates, and there's a file in that directory called credentials. So this is on the Linux or Mac operating systems. On a Windows operating system, it will be c:\users, your username, .aws, and then the file is it's also called credentials here. So this credential contains the access key and secret key so that you do not have to specify it every time you want to run that command. So let's look at some of the sample use cases. Now we want to start using it to manipulate our EC2 instances. So I'm running a AWS EC2 command. So this is the unified option we talked about. AWS is the primary command and EC2 is the sub command or the service that we are interested in. And now I'm asking, describe the instances. In other words, show me all the instances that we have in this default region that I specified earlier. So when you specify that, it shows the list of instances that we normally see on the console. If I want to start a new instance, the command is AWS EC2 run the instances. You have to specify the AMI number. In this case, I'm choosing AMI 29EBB519. I want to start one instance and I want to choose the instance type of T2 micro. I'm specifying the name of my SSH key pair, the security groups that I want to assign this instance to, and then I want to output the instance ID when it's done. So essentially, when you run this command, at the end of this, at the end of the command, you are shown the instance ID of the brand new instance we just created. And if you want to stop the instance, the command is simple: AWS EC2 stop the instances, stop-instances, the name of the instance ID that you're interested in. So in this case, I'm specifying I-1A2B3C4D. That's the instance I want to stop. Once this command is executed, this instance will be stopped. Let's see how to use the AWS CLI for our S3 bucket. So if I do AWS S3 ls, it shows me the list of S3 buckets I have. If I want to create a brand new bucket, I want to use the AWS S3 MB for make a bucket, S3 : the name of the bucket I'm interested in. Again, all the rules apply when you're creating the name of the bucket. This bucket name has to be unique across all AWS accounts. So you want to choose a bucket name that will be available to you. And if you want to copy a file to S3 bucket, a local file that's on my directory on my laptop, I'm going to use AWS S3 CP for copy local file onto the name of the bucket. If I want to synchronize the contents of a local directory, I can use AWS S3 sync command, that is for synchronization, my local directory to my S3 bucket. Now, if I want to copy the files back, all I have to do is swap this order. So I can say AWS S3 CP, the name of a bucket, space, the local file I want to name. So that copies the file from the S3 bucket onto the local directory. And if I want to delete this bucket, the command is RB. Instead of MB, I would say AWS S3 RB and the name of the bucket, and then it deletes that bucket. And if you want to delete every file in that bucket, and you can just add the --force option, it deletes all the contents of the file and the bucket when it's done. So again, that's the option to use AWS CLI to manage S3 buckets. So in summary, we learned what is AWS CLI, we learned what the services that are supported, we learned how to set up our AWS CLI, how to configure it using the AWS configure command, and we learned where it stores the credentials, and we learned how to manipulate our EC2 instances, our S3 instances and then we finally learned how to manipulate the S3 objects, buckets in S3 objects, and how to create the buckets using AWS CLI.